I'm Gary Edelman with the Civil War Trust War Department, and we're here at the Andersonville National Historic Site, and I'm with Chief of Interpretation Eric Leonard, and we're going to be talking all about Andersonville, Camp Sumter. Thanks for joining us.
Glad you're here.
So here we are in the northeast corner of the expanded stockade. What are some of the features of the stockade that one could see when they come here?
The defining feature is the wall with the sentry posts all the way around. It's a pine wall, pine posts harvested locally at the site, 20 feet tall, buried 5 feet into the ground to form a 15-foot perimeter. Just inside that is a very humble fence line, and that fence is probably the single most significant feature here. That is the deadline, and the deadline is a management tool whose purpose is simply to keep prisoners away from the wall and away from guards. And how does a fence do that? It's not the fence, it's what the guards do associated with the deadline. Guards here are instructed to shoot to kill prisoners who touch or cross that deadline.
What else is within the stockade?
A mass of people, and this is a complex place where you have veteran soldiers who are attempting to maintain life and normalcy in a place where that's very, very difficult. Food is brought in once a day. Shelter depends on what you have left with you when you arrive and what you can improvise, and those shelters vary wildly depending on the resources of the individual prisoner, their ingenuity. Water was provided in a single stream going through the middle of the original stockade when it was designed. And it's important to note the prison was intended, it was designed to hold 6,000 to 10,000 prisoners. By August, it's 3 times that capacity, and that expansion has consequences. The floodplain of the prison, that flat spot, becomes a swamp that is a vile place with maggots, food, excrement, grease from the guard camps and the prison facilities located outside of the stockade wall just upstream.
Obviously, there's a lot going on in this complex outside the stockade. Can you describe that in brief?
You have a series of hospitals serving both the prison population, the Confederate guard staff. 2 miles to the south of the main compound was a smallpox hospital used to isolate the prisoners with that dreaded disease. The Camp Sumter military prison complex stretches an entire mile to the west to the train tracks, the community of Andersonville, and you have guard camps, warehouses, officers' quarters and offices, all surrounding the prison. And then to the northwest of the prison stockade is the burying ground, what is today Andersonville National Cemetery.
And in brief, how many soldiers are there?
Today, we remain an active national cemetery, and so that you have the 12,920 prisoners who perish here, another 1,000 Civil War dead relocated to this site after the war. Our total number of interments is over 20,000 today.
The museum here interprets and deals with, honestly, horrible situations from a lot of different conflicts. Where does Andersonville sit in terms of those? Is it the worst? Is it not even close?
It's important to us to understand that each prisoner of war experience is unique to the individual, to the circumstances of that time, and it's hard to compare tragedies. And the best example of that is in 14 months, 13,000 people die here. In a single month, in August of 1864, 3,000 perish here. In the entirety of the operation of the Elmira prison in 1864 and 1865, in New York, 3,000 people die in a year. At Auschwitz in World War II, 3,000 people die in an hour. You can't compare these things.
Eric Leonard, thanks so much for joining us here. Andersonville is a place unlike any other, and I think if you come, and you should, this will be a moving experience for you. And thank you for watching.
I'm Doug Ullman with the Civil War Trust War Department. I'm sitting here at the inverted V on the North Anna battlefield, where from May 23rd to May 26, 1864, the Union Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia once again locked in battle in the heart of the Overland Campaign. I'm joined by Mike Miller and Bobby Crick, both historians and both experts on the North Anna battlefield. We're going to talk about what happened here 150 years ago. So guys, after a bloody 2 weeks here in May of 1864, Grant is once again trying to get around Lee's right flank. Is Grant just the most unimaginative commander, or what's his plan here?
Based on his previous experience in the West, his target was really Lee's army. So the movement to the North Anna was a chance to, at first, get Lee out of the trenches.
Even though he's been successful at stopping Grant's army every time they've met in battle, he's really on his heels, and Lee doesn't like to be on the defensive. So Bobby, how is Robert E. Lee trying to take back the initiative here?
Well, Lee tried to seize the initiative, but didn't have the tools to do it. And Lee, of course, was having to make do with what he had. His next alternative was the South Anna River, which is even less defensible, and then the Chickahominy River, which is not really in question, and then the outskirts of Richmond. And so, although you don't see it in the tone of his dispatches, I'm sure there was a little bit of desperation and anxiety greater in Lee's mind than had been earlier in the campaign.
And speaking of anxiety on Lee's part, his army has been just put through the ringer. Both armies are really not accustomed to this kind of pace of fighting. We haven't really seen that in the East. What's sort of the toll that all of this has taken on the army?
Lee had lost Longstreet, he'd lost Jeb Stuart, A.P. Hill was sick, Richard Ewell was sick, Lee himself was sick, confined to his tent with dysentery, unable to take advantage of the brief window of opportunity that he had presented to him here at the North Anna. And evidence of just how sick he was is from the story about one of his staff officers going into his tent and saying, General Lee, you're too sick to command the army, we need to call in General Beauregard. And that's my version of a last resort. That's at the highest level. At the lowest level, or the lower level, Confederate Army was extremely emaciated from just the appalling losses of the Wilderness in Spotsylvania and the 3 consecutive weeks of marching and fighting.
Arriving on May 22nd, Lee establishes a strong blocking position on a series of commanding bluffs south of the river. Grant reaches the North Anna on May 23rd and begins crossing that very day, testing the rebel lines. Several days of indecisive fighting follow as Grant realizes the formidable nature of Lee's position. It's a trap designed to force Grant to split his army into pieces where it can be defeated in detail.
And when does the fighting really begin in the North Anna battles?
2 large episodes on the 23rd, the fighting for Hennigan's Redoubt on the north bank of the North Anna River, and then the balance of what we call the Battle of the North Anna is the fighting at Jericho Mill, which was also on the afternoon of May the 23rd. Some action on May 24th, including where we are here at Ox Ford, and then some sputtering on the 25th and the 26th, and then the morning of the 27th, Grant was gone.
The advantage point you're looking at is if you're a Union soldier, the 22nd Massachusetts, coming up to this plateau and looking across at open fields. You've actually breached the Confederate line at North Anna, and there's no one here. Why? And all of a sudden, they start to hear a rustling out there in the trees, and they know what that means. The Confederate battle line is advancing.
The great view over my shoulder is similar to what some Confederate soldiers would have had during the zenith of the fight at Jericho Mill on May the 23rd, as some Confederates managed to burst out of the trees behind the camera and threaten to drive elements of the Union 5th Corps back to their pontoon crossing over the North Anna River. 4 brigades of Cadmus Wilcox's Confederate Division were engaged here, different degrees of severity. Those with the greatest success were able to surge across this field, elbowing aside refugees from Griffin's Federal Division and Cutler's Federal Division, only to be stopped in a dramatic episode when they ran face first into a roaring line of Union artillery, which was posted on the ridge in the middle distance over my shoulder. Canister fire in the nick of time was sufficient to stop the Confederate threat from Wilcox's division.
When people think about the Battle of North Anna, they usually hear one of two things. They hear about this inverted V where we now sit, and they hear about Lee trying to trap Grant. What is this inverted V, and how does it figure into Lee's plan?
Basically, even after the salient at Spotsylvania, which does not work out so well, and he says we must have no more salients, they come up with a salient position, which is the inverted V. Because you have the inverted V, Grant can cross the Jericho Mill, and he can cross the Telegraph Bridge, but by his sheer impetuosity, divides his army into 3. Because now he's got the 5th Corps over here, going to be the 6th Corps, 9th Corps still on the north bank, and the 2nd Corps is over here. Three parts that are divided by the North Anna River. So if one wing wants to reinforce the other, you've got to cross the river twice.
So Bobby, what goes wrong for Lee? Why doesn't he attack?
Well, Lee didn't attack because of his own personal sickness, which literally confined him to his tent, and so that steady leadership was missing. But beyond that, his top trustworthy subordinates were no longer at his disposal. If this was a situation in 1862, Stonewall Jackson would have been on those isolated Yankee corps like a hawk on a groundhog. And in 1864, there was no one to turn to. The most tangible result on the battlefields of North Anna, the most tangible effect, was seen the following week at Cold Harbor, because he got himself into a pickle with this Confederate inverted V. He was vulnerable. Confederates didn't come out of the entrenchments to attack him here, and so Grant read that as evidence that the Confederates had lost their backbone. He went on record on May the 26th, writing to the authorities in Washington. He says, Lee's army is really whipped. They won't fight outside of their own entrenchments anymore. I may be mistaken, but I think the result is assured. And then a week later, he attacked at Cold Harbor with ill preparation and got smashed, badly smashed.
Yeah, North Anna, really, talk about it as a puzzle piece. You know, if you have your puzzle of the Civil War, and Gettysburg is a piece, and Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, but North Anna is that missing piece that kind of draws it together so that it makes sense.
It is that important puzzle piece that connects that first part of the Overland Campaign to Cold Harbor. Bobby, why do you think that this segment of the Overland Campaign is probably the most overlooked of the 4 major battles?
I think the answer to that's pretty easy, Doug. There's 2 things. One is the lack of a well-defined battle. Jericho Mill is the heaviest fighting at North Anna, but it's not a very large battle compared to the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, all of which were massive. But beyond that, it's also a matter of preservation and accessibility. There's a direct relationship between visitors going to battlefields and the notoriety and publicity of a battlefield.
Well, there you have it, folks. The Battle of North Anna, a chess match fought on a pristine battlefield. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Bobby. And thank you for watching.
The spectacular view in the distance over our shoulders is the historic Fontaine Farm. To my knowledge, this is one of literally a half dozen places in all of Central Virginia, battlefield places, that has the desired recipe of historical integrity of the landscape and historical significance of what happened on the ground. And I think most historians admire what happened here and are aware of the significance. Wouldn't you agree with that, Mike?
Absolutely agree. And it's easy to visualize what happened here, and easy to teach that to students of the Civil War or the general public. You can almost hear the rebel yells and Union huzzas here on these fields, echoing even to this day.
I'm Gary Edelman.
And I'm Tim Smith.
We're both licensed battlefield guides here at the Gettysburg National Military Park. And as guides, we know that there are scores of cool facts about Little Round Top that we don't think people know about. So we thought we'd share a few of those with you today.
For instance, did you know that the original road that led to the top of Little Round Top actually came right up here where the path is now, and cars would drive right in front of us and around in front of the 44th New York Monument?
Although you might not be able to put it to any practical purpose, we know from an early 1900s photo that this rock sat on this rock as recently as 1910.
The original road system that led to the top of Little Round Top actually took a different path from the current one, turning off the modern Sykes Avenue and across in front of us by the monument to the 155th Pennsylvania. In addition, the monument has been altered. The original monument did not have the statue on it, which was added a few years later.
The 16th Michigan's monument was not originally on the boulder on which it sits now, but rather on a base on which I stand several feet away.
Depending on what you refer to as a monument, it is actually rock carvings that still exist that are some of the earliest features of the battlefield that commemorate the soldiers. On this particular rock, it says, "Colonel Strong Vincent fell here, commanding the 3rd Brigade, 1st Division, 5th Corps, July 2nd, 1863. And this inscription was placed upon this rock by 1865. Some suggest 1864, before the war had ended.
This large monument to the 91st Pennsylvania replaced a smaller monument that used to sit upon a base just beyond where this large monument is. The smaller monument was then moved out to this location upon the rock where supposedly Weed and Hazlitt were killed. This monument added an inscription to reflect that Weed was killed here, and on the rock itself, just beyond this monument, is a carving there since 1864 at least that denotes that this is the rock where Weed and Hazlitt fell.
In the summer of 1878, 2 monuments were placed on the battlefield. One of them was a marker to the spot where Colonel Strong Vincent fell. It was one of the earliest monuments placed on the battlefield outside the National Cemetery. The monument here currently is actually a replacement of the original monument.
The pile of rocks behind me are referred to in early tour books as natural fortifications, natural rock arc, Devil's Den, but most commonly the curious rocks, which are much larger than you expect them to be.
On the evening of July 1st, morning of July 2nd, there were 12th Corps regiments of Geary's division on Little Round Top.
During the battle for Little Round Top, units of the Union 6th Corps actually arrive, and here we have the 121st New York commanded by Emory Upton, the famous Upton of Spotsylvania, and the 98th Pennsylvania, which actually charged down Little Round Top into the Valley of Death with the Pennsylvania Reserves at dusk. Because late 19th century visitors would climb upon the rock and actually damage the Warren statue, the U.S. War Department actually considered digging a moat around the entire Warren rock.
The plaque that was put on the rock to keep visitors from climbing on it actually also mentions a tablet on the front, and many a visitor has fallen in an attempt to get around to see the plaque, which talks about General Warren's great military sagacity.
There's lots of interesting information about the 12th and 44th New York. Tim?
This monument, at the time of its erection, was the most expensive of the monuments that was placed on the Gettysburg battlefield.
It's constructed here on site of Prospect Hill, Maine granite, and very few monuments on the battlefield are made of this particular material.
This unit is your average Gettysburg unit. At the outbreak of the Civil War, it had about 1,000 men. It was organized primarily in Albany, New York, but it had men in it from supposedly every county of New York.
It's to the entire 44th New York as well as 2 companies of the 12th New York. Therefore, the interior of the chamber is 12 feet wide, and the height of the monument is 44 feet tall, 44 feet 6 inches actually.
At the Battle of Gettysburg, the unit had 300 men, the average size of an infantry unit for the Northern Army at the Battle of Gettysburg, 313 they had. They suffered about a third of their loss of their men, which is the average loss at the Battle of Gettysburg.
The 44th New York's monument has a plaque on it that says that their line of battle was located 100 feet in front of the monument and was marked by an advanced marker. That marker was never placed, and all but certainly that marker later became the 5th Corps headquarters marker.
And of course, one of the more interesting things about it is the names of every man that served in this unit during the Civil War are on one of the plaques inside the monument.
In this rocky pen stood Generals Meade, Sykes, Sedgwick, Warren, Pleasanton, and Crawford on the afternoon of July 3rd to discuss the forward movement of the Union Army after Pickett's charge.
A little known fact is that on July 3rd, there were several Massachusetts units on Little Round Top, and later they put up plaques to mark where their position was during that day. They had monuments for their second day's position elsewhere, and the posts of these plaques that once stood on Little Round Top still exist.
I'm standing along a stone wall, which according to this sign was built on July 3rd. But in fact, this wall was not built for at least a decade after the Civil War, and this sign refers to another wall that was in fact built after the fighting on Little Round Top was over, a wall that still exists further down the slope. When the Civil War Trust comes out into the field and speaks with historians and we analyze battles and battlefields, how do these historians know what happened during the Civil War? Obviously, as far as I know, none of them were there. But we, of course, start with primary sources. And the most primary sources of all are, of course, the earliest accounts of the battle. Most Civil War officers, or at least many, submitted official reports for their units after a particular fight. You, of course, have early photos of a battlefield. And those photos, despite some myths about photographers moving bodies around all the time, really don't lie. And then, of course, you have the battlefields themselves that really help as primary sources. You also have early cartography, maps that shows what a battlefield looked like at the time. And you can put these early sources together and really start to understand what happened during the war. To that, we can add a copious amount of post-war accounts. You have early newspaper accounts. You also have regimental histories written about particular units. You have veterans' newspapers, like the National Tribune and the Confederate Veteran. You have large numbers of various secondary books written about particular units, the Union Second Corps of the Army of the Potomac, for instance, and so many other particular Confederate brigades. And you can take all these things together along with photos, early accounts, and battlefields, and then some even oral accounts, you know, as it got much later, and put these things together and really get a good understanding of the battlefield. However, any particular battle, especially that we're analyzing today, is inherently interpretive. You take this evidence and you might say that an account written the day after the battle is a lot more reliable than one written 20 years later, but these are some of the challenges that all historians and interpreters have in trying to interpret and understand a Civil War event. Because on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, Benning's Georgia Brigade charged through this particular gully here at Devil's Den. In 1913, a guy named William R. Houghton came back and wrote home to his newspaper complaining about the lack of Confederate monuments, but also wrote about the place that he had fought 50 years earlier. He specifically wrote about charging through a rock-filled gorge, and he remembers the line of blue-coated regulars above him, not quite 20 feet. He also talked about how the gallant Muse and a guy named Mays also were shot through the head by the almost vertical fire from these rocks. So you stop, and I went and looked back, and there is, in fact, a guy named Houghton fighting here in the 2nd Georgia on July 2nd, 1863. And indeed, there was somebody named Muse and somebody named Mays that were shot and killed with head wounds that day. So Houghton is at least relating something that really happened, and his account continues. He says that Mays fell to his left, striking his feet. And he said that the Government Avenue now runs over the spot where it happened, and not a few yards away from a sign that says Devil's Den on it. And this is really important to me because, stick with me, here you have a guy that fought in the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 and comes back in 1913 and uses a road put in 1897 and a sign put in 1900 to tell us today what happened in 1863. Okay, so you can use an early account about what the 2nd Georgia did. You can use his reference to a road that wasn't here during the battle, but is here now and was here when the veterans came back, and a sign to help us understand a little better. And finally, if his account is correct about where these guys fell, the 2nd Georgia isn't exactly where I expected them to be. I always thought they were further out in that direction as opposed to closer to the rocks, and now as a historian, I have to deal with that. This is the type of things historians really have to get into all the time.